Some of you, I don't know if all of you attended our session back in June last year, where I discussed an overview of the global situation with human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And I did say towards the end of that presentation that maybe when we meet again now, the starting point might be to look at some of the key issues relating to human rights education. And in fact, I pose the question, what exactly do we mean by human rights education? Now, this is a question that I posed, knowing that you probably all have the answer because you probably know this better than I do, since I've no doubt you're being involved in your various roles as teachers and educators with these issues. So I'm not assuming that I'm talking to people who need to be told what human rights education is, but I think it's important that we just remind ourselves before we zoom in on some of the issues that people raised in the responses that we got when we asked you to tell us some of the issues that you think are important to you, or some of the issues that you have been encountering in your classrooms and in your spaces and so on. So I would like to start by just suggesting that there are three preliminary questions that we need to have at the back of our minds as we discuss these things. I'm not going to go through all these questions, but just something that might be of interest later on when you review the recording and when you review the PowerPoint presentation, which I have promised to share with everybody at the end of the presentation, at the end of the session today. So the first thing is we need to have some clarity perhaps, or to ask ourselves whether we are talking about navigating or teaching human rights education. And I suggest that it is important to understand the difference and that this might matter in a number of ways, particularly in two ways. First of all, it would appear to me that when we limit our conversations to navigating human rights education, there might be a misunderstanding or indeed a suggestion that we are really talking about how to find our way through the maze of human rights issues in our positions, in our work as educators, et cetera, how to steer ourselves around these issues, rather than how to teach human rights education itself, or how to teach human rights in the context of our educational endeavors. So I am approaching this with the understanding that we are really talking about navigating and not teaching human rights education as such. But I'll speak to that issue of what it means to teach human rights education and what that requires and what that the content of human rights education might well be. So that's one question. The second question is, of course, to ask ourselves whether we actually understand what we need to understand, which is what are human rights. So before we can talk about teaching human rights education or navigating human rights education, it requires us to have a sense, some knowledge, some information about what human rights are. I'm not going to talk about this because this is what we tried to cover last summer. I went through the first part of my presentation. I remember, just talking about what human rights are and the sources of human rights, the law on human rights, and so on and so forth, and went through some of the principal or major instruments which collectively give us this body of law that we call international human rights law. And then I will end with this third reflection on what is human rights education rather than what is human rights. And this is what I want to focus on for the next 15 or 20 minutes before we then move on to a consideration of some of the issues that were specifically pointed out, and open it up for discussions and questions and comments, and just have an exchange of views amongst ourselves. So the question, what is human rights education, I think needs to be located in the very starting instruments. And the basis, the conceptual and normative basis for human rights education is really to be found in that document that we talked about last summer and which you are all familiar with, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, adopted as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and nations. As a declaration, it wasn't meant to be legally binding when it was adopted. No state had to sign it or ratify it, as is normally the case with international treaties, and as is the case with all the subsequent human rights treaties that have been adopted. But it is generally regarded as, in fact, providing the normative basis for human rights today, because after decades of state practice, after decades of the provisions of this declaration being incorporated in various instruments that have had to be signed and ratified by states, we are at a point where we can safely say the Universal Declaration is in fact a form of customary international law, and therefore the fact that it hasn't had to be signed by anybody is irrelevant. In fact, the US Supreme Court did indicate in a couple of cases that although it is not a treaty that was ratified by the US, it is nevertheless regarded as providing a binding body of law on human rights issues, which as customary law is also binding on the United States. So we find in the declaration, first of all, the preamble, which suggests that the teaching and education to promote the rights articulated in the declaration is in fact a fundamental objective of the declaration. And then we find Article 26 of the declaration, which provides for the right to education itself in a very general sense. And it directs states to respect the position that education should be directed to the full development of the human personality and strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. So the combination of what we find in the preamble and what we find in Article 26 and the general sense of the declaration really suggests to us that human rights education is in fact itself a human right. I shall come back to that point in a little while. Now, what are the aims of human rights education? You might say the aims are to build a world of human rights culture, or a world in which a human rights culture gives us the operational framework. And this would be a world in which everyone's rights and freedoms are respected. It would be a world in which people understand not only their rights and responsibilities, but also are able to recognize violations of these human rights when they happen, and more importantly, take action if they can in their own personal capacities to protect the rights of other people. And this is where the obligations or the responsibilities of educators, of teachers come in, that we are in this fiduciary position as representatives of society to try and educate our students, our learners, our pupils on the fundamental issues of human rights, and inculcating them the spirit of taking action, whatever that action might be, to underscore and strengthen the respect for human rights of everybody else, of other people in our communities and in our environments, including the school environment. So when we talk about this human rights culture, there are a number of elements that I'll just point out, not all of them comprehensively, but they include, for example, this notion, this idea of strengthening respect for everyone's human rights, the idea of valuing human dignity, and also developing individual self-respect for ourselves in the hopes that we can then develop attitudes and behaviors that will lead to respect for others. So we need to interrogate our own positions and understandings and ask ourselves whether in fact how we relate to others, including our students, is in fact in the best interest for the benefit of strengthening respect for human rights generally. Promoting understanding and appreciating diversity. This is particularly important in view of some of the issues that we'll talk about later on. Appreciating diversity in our school communities, appreciating diversity in our societies, particularly towards national, ethnic, religious, and so on, minorities. And equally importantly, empowering people, especially the young people, students, pupils, learners, towards a more active and inclusive citizenship, which is a prerequisite for a general respect for human rights and freedoms in our societies. So, as I said, human rights education is itself a human right. It is itself a human right, one, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights suggests as much, but secondly, also because probably the most important or one of the most important international human rights instruments to which the United States is a party, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, obligates state parties, every state that is a party to that covenant, to promote and respect the rights recognized in the covenant, to ensure that all individuals within its jurisdiction, citizens and non-citizens, nationals and non-nationals, enjoy these rights. Now, you might have thought that this ought to be obvious. Human rights are stories that we read about in our newspapers every day. There is always a story implicating human rights, whether it is in our localities here in central Pennsylvania or nationally, et cetera, et cetera. But often you don't get the sense that the level of human rights literacy or awareness is at the level at which it should be. People read stories in the media, in the papers, without actually thinking about them as human rights issues. So for example, just this morning, some of the breaking news coming through from the New York Times point to the fact that there are attempts by some groups to challenge the decisions by some elite schools in federal litigation, challenging these schools on their admissions policies, because some people feel that these admissions policies, which are aimed at increasing diversity within these school communities, are actually disadvantaging certain groups and therefore are violations of their rights, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's a story somebody can read without really thinking about it in terms of human rights violations and so on. Or the other story in the New York Times this morning, that the Biden administration is in fact taking measures to address the issue of environmental justice, racial injustice, environmental racial injustice, but without using the term race, because I suppose somebody regards it as too sensitive, etc. So we want to talk about environmental justice, etc., without using the term race. But whatever we do when we talk about environmental justice, we are actually going to be talking about human rights. So I'm just trying to point out that there is this phenomenon that we see on a daily basis in our papers, and yet we are not quite always conscious that what we are looking at are issues dealing with human rights. And the reason for this, at least in the United States, is obvious, because when an American talks about, I have my rights, I want to assert my rights, they often think only in terms of civil and political rights, because that's what our Constitution, that's what our Bill of Rights, that's what our laws and so on essentially emphasize. Freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, right to fair trial, et cetera, et cetera. That's the focus, civil and political rights. But there are so many other rights that are particularly relevant in the school context and in the context of human rights education that we don't think about much. And these are what you might call the social, economic, and cultural rights. Rights to healthcare, rights to adequate housing, the right to education itself is not regarded as a civil or political right, but a different kind of right. And so here in the US, our approach and our practice has been to emphasize the classical civil and political rights, and actually suggest that these other rights, social, economic, and cultural rights, are not, strictly speaking, human rights at all. But if you adopt that approach, then you pretty much exclude much of the conversation that ought to be going out there in schools when we talk to our learners, our students, when we discuss issues of justice, et cetera, because quite a lot of that hinges on an appreciation and acceptance of the idea that social, economic, and cultural rights are also, in fact, human rights. Now, of course, the problem is compounded by the fact that the United States is not a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The US signed this covenant, but has never ratified it. And that's why in the context of our political debates here, you'll find when people talk about the right to education or the right to health, others on the other side of the spectrum will push back and say, those are not rights, those are just aspirations, etc. And we shouldn't be laden with obligations that require us to uphold and respect and implement those kinds of rights. So that's important. But going back then to the specific issue of human rights education, how do we define it? And here, I'm not inventing the definition, I'm just borrowing the definition that both the United Nations and Human Rights Education USA, which is a body that produces materials and helps schools, as you well know, to guide them in their human rights education programs, has defined education, training, and information that is aimed at building a universal culture of human rights through the sharing of knowledge, imparting of skills, etc., etc. I will not repeat this because this is part of what I said earlier on about aiming for a world of human rights culture. That's what human rights education is about. The question then is, why should we promote it? Why should we promote human rights education in our schools? Well, the general understanding and the general arguments that you'll find are that human rights education is a crucial component of the realization of human rights, as well as the long-term prevention of human rights abuses and so on, and prevention of conflicts in our societies. That if we don't educate young people, or indeed any other people, because human rights education is not limited to the young people, but here we are specifically talking about human rights education in the school context, that we lose out by not being able to develop a culture of prevention of abuses, long-term prevention of abuses. And we do not then equip ourselves to address some violent or social conflicts that might crop up in our societies when people start arguing about what their entitlements are as against what others should or should not do with respect to them, etc. So it is, human rights education is something that is an important component of the right to education, as I say, because it enables us to fulfill that educational objective of promoting the full development of human personality, the human personality, appreciation of human dignity, It enables us to strengthen respect for human rights and actually deliver quality education for all. Education that does not attempt to bring in these notions of human dignity, equality, social justice, etc., may not quite be complete. So quality education requires that we incorporate these ideas in what we do. It doesn't mean that we have to teach a course called human rights or that we construct something that we call human rights education. But when we teach various aspects of education, moral education, social history, when we teach citizenship and so on, other types of components of education, we should try to infuse in those other aspects these ideas of what it means to achieve respect for others, equality, etc., etc. And finally, also, it is an important component of education because it prepares our societies from an early age, from the school age, to understand the global forces that create human rights abuses. So we cannot understand, or we may not understand fully what is going on in Myanmar, the genocide of the Rohingyas in Myanmar, unless first of all, we also understand where genocide is and whether it has been part of our own history in the United States, so that we don't point at genocides out there and ignore the fact that similar occurrences have also littered parts of our history. So this idea that educating people in human rights, providing people with human rights education and the tools to understand what human rights education is important for understanding the rest of the world. Otherwise, we may not, in fact, get the sense that the world is interconnected in this way because we are all striving to address the same kind of challenges and problems. So in the school system, human rights education should therefore aim at improving quality of learning. It should be promoting youth and child-centered and participatory teaching. It should increase access to and participation in schooling by diverse communities, so respect for diversity and non-discrimination. And when, as I say, you have litigation going on, challenging some schools for their admissions policies because people are not quite happy about the idea of enhancing or strengthening diversity in these communities, that would in fact be antithetical to the whole idea of human rights education in our schools. It should aim at contributing to social cohesion. It should help develop the communication skills and informed critical thinking among our youth and students. It should provide multicultural and historical perspective on the universal struggle for justice and dignity. So how do we understand, how can we understand arguments about historical slavery? How can we understand complaints and issues about the treatment of indigenous Native Americans and the dispossessions that they suffered? How can we understand the situation of migrants and refugees in our midst, et cetera, without a sense of an understanding rather of what human rights is all about? And that we can only really do if we incorporate human rights education with these kinds of aims. But more importantly, as I say, it also is a tool to challenge students to ask what human rights mean to them personally, and to encourage them to translate their understanding of human rights or their appreciation of human rights into caring, informed, nonviolent activism, so that they can participate in improving the lot of the rest of society. When the United Nations adopted the Human Rights Education Decade back in 1994, this is a decade that covered 1995 to 2004, the UN noted a number of things, and it is that human rights education should teach three related levels of knowledge. That first of all, it should be about teaching about human rights themselves, and then teaching for human rights, and teaching in human rights. These three levels, teaching about human rights, teaching for human rights, teaching in human rights, mean slightly different things, but they're all interrelated. So education about human rights is the education that requires us to spend some time discussing with our students some of the key issues in human rights. In other words, the content of human rights. Now, not everybody who is teaching in these schools or who finds themselves teaching in these kinds of programs has had any training in human rights. Indeed, very few people formally go through training in human rights and so on. Most of us pick it up as a lived experience, and we build an interest in human rights issues, and then we find ourselves involved in teaching human rights or human rights education without the benefit of that training. But what we need to do in those situations is to try ourselves and understand what the history, what the substantive content, and what the development of human rights standards has been. At the very least, we need to appreciate that when we talk about human rights, as opposed to the average person out there, we are talking about human rights in a more comprehensive way, in an independent sort of schema, which includes both civil and political rights on the one hand, which is what we focus on in the US, and also these social, economic, and cultural rights. That's what we need to understand. Education for human rights is the learning that is aimed specifically at helping people to understand the importance of human rights, to internalize human rights values, and to integrate them in their own ways of life, their own ways of thinking, their own ways of living, and so on and so forth. This means, at the very least, embracing the principles of human equality, dignity, commitment to respect and protect the rights of other people, and so on. But it also means that what is more important is not so much what we know, what we have learned from teaching about human rights, the history, content, etc. of human rights, but how we act. How do we translate the knowledge that we have acquired about human rights in how we act as teachers, how we act as citizens, and so on, and how we inspire our students to act with this, what I call nonviolent democratic activism as good citizens. It is also, education for human rights, it is also aimed at empowering people with that knowledge to become responsible and engaged citizens committing to building a just society. And here, it's not just the people that we are teaching, but also the teachers themselves that must imbibe that knowledge and the skills and become part of the committed core that builds a just and civil society. And finally, education in human rights. This is where perhaps it impacts teachers and educators, because education in human rights presents to us a dual challenge as educators. First, it means that we must teach in such a way as to respect human rights in the classroom and the school environment itself. Respect the human rights of the people that we are teaching and interacting with in our schools, in our classrooms, right? But secondly, it also means that we ourselves have to model our own lives on human rights values, because as educators, we are role models for the young people that we teach. And so our own attitudes, our own behaviors, and how we conduct ourselves vis-a-vis other people will have a bearing on how effective that message that we try to share is in terms of human rights education. And sometimes you find that students might complain, in fact, and say, well, the teacher himself or herself is not really showing the empathy, the understanding, et cetera, for people of my background, for people like me. And I don't feel respected in the school environment, etc. So that's a challenge for educators. As for the content, I will not talk much about that because this is something that will depend on what kind of program a particular school or a particular teacher is structuring or is putting together in order to incorporate human rights issues in their teaching, etc. But what I would suggest is that if human rights education is offered and structured properly, it actually helps students to appreciate other topics that they deal with, other historical topics like the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, immigration in the US, etc., in a very different way. So suddenly you look at the masses, people amassing on the southern border from Central America, and you're not just looking at them as aliens who are trying to knock on the door and get into our country. You begin to look at them as perhaps victims of human rights violations, where they come from, and people who deserve to be given that empathetic hearing before we decide what to do with them, et cetera, et cetera. So the content of human rights education in schools, of course, will depend on the particular areas of interest of each educator and the environment in which they're working. But broadly, these are some of the general arguments and concepts and issues that inform what we mean when we talk about human rights education in schools and when we talk about human rights education as a human right in itself, and when we talk about human rights education as a very strong component of our endeavors to build a culture of human rights that respects everybody and that respects issues of equality, dignity, and diversity.